Welcome back, and if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Christopher Kaiser, and I, together with my colleagues at the Columbia Language Resource Center, helped to organize this conference, and we're excited to start our Saturday session. Without any ado whatsoever, I'm going to turn it right over to Tyler, who will introduce our first speaker.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tyler Richard, and I am the lecturer in Sanskrit and Tamil languages here at Columbia, where I oversee the Sanskrit and Tamil language programs. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce two speakers to you this morning. The first is Barbara Spinelli, who's going to be giving a talk entitled Reconceptualizing the Language Education Paradigm in Global Society, Emerging Discourse and Change in Language Programs and Classroom Practice. Barbara Spinelli is a senior lecturer in Italian at Columbia University. She worked as researcher in educational linguistics at the University for Foreigners in Perugia, Italy. She has collaborated with the Center for Language Assessment and Certifications as a teacher trainer and language tester. She has also been involved in research projects promoted by the European Commission and the Council of Europe as a language expert. She has published book chapters as well as articles in international research journals. She is the co-author of Profilo della Lingua Italiana, my Italian pronunciation, and her main research interests are network-based language learning, curriculum design, and plurilingual and intercultural education. It is my pleasure to introduce this morning Barbara Spinelli.
All right. Hello. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about how globalization has changed language education beliefs and also the conditions in which language teaching and learning take place. And so I'm going to start from a more global discourse, taking into consideration some studies on second language acquisition and applied linguistics that call for reconceptualization of language education beliefs and principles. Then I will outline the need to look for some alternative pedagogical practices that may include the specific need of the local context in which we are working. And at the end, I'm going to give you some examples on how I try to implement these principles in my classrooms here at Columbia University. So, in order to understand how global phenomena affected language education beliefs, I think we need to take into consideration to focus on a main key idea, which is that meanings are not fixed, but they are object of reinterpretation through a plurality of perspectives. I'm saying that because current scholars are questioning the standardized categories that we use so far in order to define language teaching and learning. But these static categories sometimes exclude many individuals who don't fit in these binary opposites. And so this is a big problem also for research, as Ortega points out, because sometimes statistics refers to these categorizations and so may exclude a larger group of peoples and a more complex reality. Also, scholars are trying also to provide, as I said, alternative perspectives to have a more flexible interpretation of this concept. For instance, the distinction between adult and young learners was based on the concept that age causes cognitive deficit. But they are trying to put the negative narrative in the positive narrative, that adults actually are also, they have their own expertise and they have their own accumulated experience, so that may help them to make more transfers in terms of concept and knowledge. And so the way we tell the story will really change our perception of these concepts. And one of the main discussed categories are these ideal and perfect native speakers versus non-native speakers. And that may exclude the possibility this is strictly related to the idea of perfect proficiency. So that may exclude the possibility for students to develop partial competencies and to, because they want to study the language for specific purposes. And also they don't take into consideration the fact that language learning is a lifelong learning. So they may change their profiles over time. This idea of perfection is also related to the one-to-one relationship between language and identity, which is the result of this dominant mono ideology. And so that, because of this idea of perfections, for long time multilinguals have been conceived as deficient speakers, and that caused their kind of frustration to be positioned by others as non-native speaker or foreigners. Yes. And so, and that's very important because that affected the perceptions of themselves as language speakers, and some bilinguals then don't perceive to be themselves bilinguals because of this stigmatized idea of imperfection. And I'm going just to show you a project which is actually developed in another country, but I think is very important because the data that were mentioned yesterday by Stefan that emerged from the MLA report are actually shared by other countries. In this specific project, I'm talking about United Kingdom, because there is a large number of language departments that are closing. So many English universities decide to put their energies together and to develop this project to support multilingualism. And it's interesting because one of the first activity they proposed to their students was, how do you place in this continuum from monolingual to multilingual? They position themselves most of the time close to the mono because of this idea of perfection. I cannot speak, at a high level of proficiency in my language. And so, regardless, actually, the language proficiency they had, they were multilinguals. So that raises the question, who is the second language learner today? And so far we have many studies that focus on several aspects to describe the second language learner. And this study established categories that were more focused on leading the learners to success in second language acquisition. But I think I agree completely on what Stefan said yesterday, because the question is something is missing, but what? What is missing is the person. The student has a persona, because we don't consider them as a real person with their unique history, and I will show you later how important it is. And background, and also intention, the idea that they want to invest in the language learning, and why. And I think that, language proficiency is just a small part of a larger story that we need to take into consideration. So it's not just a matter of proficiency, but also how you get there. So the role of experiences become very important. For instance, experiences of socialization they have with additional languages, or learning experiences such they learn implicitly, explicitly, or if I learn Italian with the knowledge of French, maybe a completely different experience if I learn Italian with the knowledge of German. So they call for a reconceptualization of the second language learner, and they focus particularly on the relationship between language and identity. And because language, of course, is a place where we develop our subjectivity. And so languages are who we are. So since this we are living in an interconnected, global, multilingual world, they focus particularly in multilingual identity. So it would be probably more appropriate to talk about third language or next language learner. And of course, in this identity construction, emotions play a crucial role, and also because they focus on emotion also because migrant processes created the need to express feelings and emotions in an additional language. And this can be a kind of demanding task, even if I think it can be a very enriching task as well, but I will go back to this later. And also, since we are living in a technological world, globalized world, they focus also on creativity, the fact that students can really combine in multiple ways all the semiotic resources they have at their disposal. And last but not least, they don't emulate normative practices, but they have their own capacity to react, to exist, to negotiate, to shape their learning process, and to change their profiles throughout their life. So what are the implications for language teaching and learning? First of all, we need to take into consideration that globalization on the one hand has intensified the interconnectedness across communities and facilitated flows of ideas, but on the other hand, has also emphasized the diversity of the localities. And that happens also in language teaching. Why? Because most of the time, global methods actually came into conflict with the specific local pedagogical strategies. And we have many studies that describe this kind of tension, imported methods, imported practice didn't work in the specific context. So probably it's better to talk about local solutions, which means find more adaptable and flexible pedagogy. So going back to the components I just described, I think that there are already several approaches that have been developed. First one is multiliteracy approach that we know very well because Simon offered many workshops, very interesting workshops for the implementation of this approach. And the main idea of this approach is that communicative competence today is something else, has a broader meaning. That means that students can combine several codes, several semiotic resources, several languages, or multiple channels of communication in order to make more effective their communication. So it's not just a matter of language. Language is just a small part. So they need to develop new literacy. Community-based or place-based approach, is very well. And this approach is very interesting because we need more and more to connect the reality, the classroom, with the external environment through real-world projects. And narrative approach is another approach very interesting because focus on identity construction and all the emotions involved in this identity development. There is also reflective approach that we know it's very important for students to take ownership of their language learning and also to develop their self-awareness about their identity. And plurilingual and translanguage approaches allow students to use all the linguistic resources they have in their linguistic repertoire. And so probably since these approaches share same values and practices, an integrated approach may be a global solution. Since language classes are the main site where identity is developed, these scholars are supporting more and more the idea of multilingualism. And I read many articles, newspapers, TV and blogs and academic academic publications, and many conferences like this one are talking about these topics. And all these experts actually are trying to support multilingualism, focus on the benefits that multilingual may have in their life in this world. And the first one, of course, is that they may have a richer experience in communication because they refer to different linguistic systems. Of course, they have more concept, more worldviews, and this divergent thinking also allow them to be more creative in problem solving or, for instance, in addressing global issues. And this is very important for their work because probably in the future they need to work in international team to establish international relationship. And multilingualism can also facilitate an appreciation for global citizenship values because of this connection also between language and human rights. Language curricula also incorporate what the so-called 21st skills that students should have, like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, etc. And the last but not least, they are talking about neuroscience studies, talk about the fact that if we use regularly more than one language, we can stand off dementia. That's just, to let you know. And so, which is a good news, no? Anyway, for us, at least. So, how language teaching can really intervene, to support multilingualism. And so, in this field, we are talking on psycholanguage acquisition, a multilingual turn. And why? Because the reason I mentioned before, but also because they are saying, hey, we are facing a growing composition, a multilingual composition of classes, especially here at Columbia is an example of that, and I will show you later something that I did. And multilingualism is a fact of life. Students are exposed to many languages, and we are talking about New York. We live in New York, so it's a good example of that. And so what are the implications in language teaching? Many of the arguments of these scholars come from the field of third language acquisition, which underline differences between the second language process and the third or next language process, because third language students are faster language learner because of their prior experiences, and also because they have a high cognitive flexibility due to their capacity to make more transfers at different levels and make a larger number of hypotheses about language. So many scholars suggest to include these multilingual competencies in our teaching, even if students are learning one single language. But pedagogical practices, most of them focus still on monolingual practices, and this is strictly related to the fact that they keep languages separated. So it's one language at a time, minimizing the possibility for those students to make all these connections. And so multiple linguistic and cultural lives generally are ignored or even not explored probably enough in our classrooms. And so, therefore, polylingual education should, according to these scholars, capitalize language diversity and their multilingual background, rethink monolingual strategies, probably, and consider the classroom as a site for development of multilingual identity. And so that allows students, learners to understand what means to be multilingual, which is very important. And that implies a change in teachers' ideology, teachers' beliefs about language. And this change is actually mentioned in quality systems that provide tools for evaluate language programs and teacher skills. One of these is the one proposed by ACTFL, and the highest standard state clearly that language and cultures are very important to prepare students to interact in this globalized world. And also another one, equals, which is internationally used, include the fact that promoting multilingualism is very important for instance, social cohesion, mobility, but also languages are very important for the cognitive development. And so I will show you some examples that I try to implement these approaches or principles in general in my classroom. It was a kind of adventure, but I will show it to you. Okay. So I will show you 3 examples. I will go more into details for the first one, and I will be more concise for the other 2 due to the constraint of time, but I will be more than happy to answer your questions later. So intensive elementary, here at Columbia generally is a course that covers 2 semesters in one. And the prerequisite for this course is, in our department, at least one Romance language. We don't specify the language proficiency level. So I said, okay, probably my students know at least 2 languages. So I wanted to explore a little bit more the linguistic profiles of my students. And what came out in my recent classes was that. So as you can see here, the reality is very complex, okay? There are mono, but there are plurilingual, see? So I said, oh, how can I include this complexity in my course? And so I'm teaching a very traditional course, I have to anticipate, but this is more or less the characteristics of my course. So I decided to include plurilingual objectives in my learning objectives, and also to include pedagogical practices, plurilingual practices. And so I designed a blended course, which with the support of an online learning environment. And in this environment, students could build their multilingual materials. And for that, I mean, multilingual tables, multilingual dictionaries, multilingual dialogues. And they have to explore together, that was this most important part, the reflective learning. They had to share their insights of similarity and differences across languages at the different level. So I also did some incomprehension activity. Incomprehension is a plurilingual approach that allows students to read in a language they don't know, but a language which is related with the target language because it belongs to the same language family. And I'll give you an example in a moment. So I try to integrate this online activity in my traditional curriculum. For traditional curriculum, I mean a course that still focus on the target language, in this case, Italian. So an example is in week 4, the topic of the unit was food in Italy, of course. And so I wanted to ask my students to read a complex reading on slow food movement, because it was week 4. So I decided to ask them to read a text in a Romance language, very similar, that in a Romance languages they didn't know. And in some cases was Portuguese, in other cases was Catalan. And I asked them to catch the general meaning. I asked some questions in Italian, but they were free to answer in any languages they wanted. Not because I'm so multilingual, but language could be French, Portuguese, and I can read them, the answer. So, then I submit a questionnaire, and I ask them to recall the reading strategies and cross-linguistic transfer they activated in order to tackle this reading. And then they asked to do the same process for the reading in Italian. And then they had to share in a collaborative space their insight about the reading strategies and interlingual transfer that they activated in order to tackle these readings. And that was very interesting because a lot of peer tutoring and peer scaffolding occurred. And so I also try to manage this change. I say, okay, now let's see what's going to happen. These are the instruments I use, but I'm going to focus on these three. And the language proficiency midterm test is the test that we submit halfway through the semester, all of us, and is a test all skills, and except for oral language, but listening is included, and also, of course, grammar and lexical competence. And so I want to show you some result of this one, especially for reading and writing, because I did a specific work. I created a test with a gradual increase in complexity in terms of text type I submit, and in terms of reading sub-skills, ranging from the one who require a lower cognitive load to the one which requires more complex cognitive processes. And then the input of the writing, the genre, was strictly connected to the third reading. And I made statistical analysis in order to see how are the benefits, if there are, of this plurilingual approach. And I found that plurilingual instruction has had an impact on the development of these two skills. And actually, students show, according to the data, they had the full mastery of A2 plus of the Common European Framework, intermediate mid, ACTFL, descriptors for reading. And that was the level they were supposed to reach at the end of the course. And we are talking about halfway through the course. And mostly interesting, I think, is the fact that in writing, they reach B1 already. And so that means that the writing skills help the reading development and not vice versa. And of course, I also could see that interlingual positive transfers were diffusely activated by my students. And especially, even if they were still focused on linguistic future word ordering, and while going ahead through the readings, they had more and more problems when they have to make transfers at the literacy-related skills, such as make inferences, for instance, or explore a little bit more, identify more abstract ideas, such as, for instance, wishes and feelings of our authors, and so forth. And the last is that interlingual positive transfer occur according to the proficiency level of languages they know. In fact, just to give you an example, to be clear, the students who got the highest score in the reading test were the students who had very similar profiles. So a very high language proficiency in Spanish, and also a very similar background, for instance, a long stay in a Spanish-speaking country. So when I ask them what are the plurilingual activities most useful for them to tackle these readings, they say the intercomprehension activities and also the activities that focus on similarities and differences at the word level. And they consider less important and helpful the interlinguistic comparison in terms of the use of grammar structure when we try to compare. They don't think they were very so helpful for reading. And some comments very quickly. They said that was very interesting because this kind of approach, I think, stimulate a lot their curiosity for other language, and also develop a little bit of this idea of partial competencies. So they said, I improved my Italian, but also develop a little bit of basic of other languages, and also reading in a language I don't know, really improve my confidence in reading, and also develop kind of, they were very surprised. So surprised that some students of my class went to take Portuguese, and also another one went to take Catalan. So I think that, I was surprised also seeing that they say, okay, we want more of these activities in the classroom, more than once a week, because it wasn't once a week. And of course, they said also, maybe we need a more theoretical framework, because they are completely, it's completely new. Even if we did some readings of familiarize what plurilingualism means, but, And I was struck by the last comment, because our students said, I think that I learned how language learning can even be even more an enriching experience in my life. So, second example, I go very quickly. In this activity for this course, Intermediate Conversation 1, I adopted a narrative approach, and because narrative, as I said before, is the main organizing principle for learners to make sense of their plurilingual identity. So the story is a kind of object of my inquiry, what I could learn from their stories. And the fact that multilingualism may occur in different ways according to different contexts, could be more conflictual, could be more harmonious, could be invisible, as we saw at the beginning. So, but they have this capacity that can positioning and repositioning themselves within their multiple identities. And reflective learning, I really think, play a crucial role to develop this agency. So the project was my plurilingual self. I prepared through some activities to do this project in the middle, halfway through the course, and is an oral presentation. They have to present their oral pluribiography. And I provided some guidelines, and they had to use, starting through metaphors, to describe their multilingual self. And of course, through experiences, through places, through encounters, and linguistic expressions particularly meaningful for them. And then I videotaped this presentation, and I asked them right after through a questionnaire to first of all self-evaluate the linguistic competence, but then mostly importantly to reflect upon the way they constructed their narration, because this discursive construction of narrative is very, very important because they convey how they convey themselves in the oral text is very important. For instance, how they represent events, or from which language they start and why, how they define through what language, for instance, through what adjectives they define, their experiences, their relationship with languages is also very important. And the last activity was a follow-up interview, one-to-one, because very many interesting things emerged during the second phase. And so I want them to elaborate a little bit in depth this concept with me, and also what remained unsaid, because I think there was a lot to say. And the last my last project is a project that I don't go into details, because I was particularly inspired by a conference organized by Stefan, the languages and the staff, of course, and Reading the City, and also a conference and workshop organized by Lee Abrams, and together with some colleagues from the Spanish department. So I asked my students to explore multilingualism outside the classroom through the urban and linguistic semiotic landscapes of the city, and to develop their personal narration and to create their own digital artifact. But I leave the floor to Lee for that. Conclusion, I conclude that in this globalized world, probably we talk a lot about language education, but probably we need to talk about the importance of languages in education, which is something different. And also the role of teaching in this perspective, because teachers are the real policymakers in the classroom. So we have all these principles coming from studies, coming from language policy, but then we have to make our own decision in our classrooms. So teacher intervention is so important, fundamental to have an impact in students' language ideology. Students' beliefs about language and perception about themselves as language speakers, which is so important. And the classroom, so we should think that the classroom, as Garcia states, is a plurality of singularities. And I believe that these two aspects, we need to take this into consideration, these aspects while in our instructional design. And I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara. I think we have a couple minutes for a few questions. Chris and Piero are going around with a microphone if anyone would like to ask a question or to Barbara.
So if you have any questions, otherwise I just would like to add something about the last, the plurilingual biography. I think it's so important because that is an iterative learning process, and so they have several moments to think about their plurilingual identity, and I could actually understand where I could find some conflicts, and so I could intervene through activities to change a little bit their perspectives. For instance, I'm talking about an heritage language speakers, and she was a kind of ashamed to be the origins to be from Naples. So, you know, the first word they associate. Piero, giusto? You are a good representante. So the first words, when I say, okay, what kind of words you would associate to Naples? And she raised her hand and she said, okay, camorra, mafia, dirty. Okay, and I say, okay, fine. And so I tried to propose alternative perspectives. For instance, many of the students don't know that Naples was a big capital in the first years of 19th century, and they were the first system of lighting, the first railway, and so and there, for instance, there is a beautiful subway stop where is one of the most beautiful in Europe, and with a good expression of contemporary art. So at the end, I did a lot of work with language, Napoletano with Italian, finding links. So at the end, she said, when I say, okay, what you learned from this experience? And she raised her hand and said, okay, at the beginning of this course, I was really ashamed to be Napolitan, but I have to say that now I'm very proud. Maybe it's a very enthusiastic statement, but I found that was a kind of interesting, find a way to reposition ourselves in this kind of, perception. So, yes.
Hang on, there's a question here, and then Jane has the microphone.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Would you please share would you please elaborate on the data for the pre and the post reading survey?
Yes.
You listed several activities. I just
I go back
about the sequence of these
sure.
activities, and then do they require the same cognitive resources from the readers, or how do you organize them? What is the first step? What is the second step? So,
okay, the first step was pre-self-evaluation. So I tried to collect a lot of information about their linguistic experiences and profile profile. That's why I couldn't do the correlation statistics, the number of languages or the proficiency they had with specific sub-reading skills or sub-writing skills. So I collected a lot of information at the beginning of the course. And the last section was about plurilingual objectives. So they have to evaluate themselves, for instance, how I can recognize an unfamiliar word through my familiar words. A word in a familiar language through the familiar languages I know, and this kind of, they had to kind of evaluate, there was a scale, because I wanted to compare the beginning and the end of my course, if something changed, and actually something changed. Then I did this proficiency midterm test, and I don't know if you were asking exactly for the construct of that test, or in order to make a gradual increase on complexity the text, I refer to a taxonomy that it was in my book, the Profilo della Lingua Italiana, which is a project which was promoted by the Council of Europe. And so we divided the genre according to the level, and then in terms of complexity of reading some skills, I refer to Weir and Khalifa socio-cognitive model of reading, and in this model, put in kind of scale, the reading that require a lower cognitive processes and going ahead. And then teacher's diary, I took some notes when I saw some changes in the classrooms or interesting contribute for students. And I audio recorded sometimes some part of my class, and the post-evaluation I asked themselves to, what is your take from this experience? And also they have to evaluate again through the plurilingual objectives, if something has changed or not, and provide some feedback for change in activities and this kind of.
Hi, thank you very much. You had a great talk to start us off on this Saturday morning. I had a question. You mentioned for the intensive Italian class that you flipped it and that you did some online.
Yeah.
Can you tell us which parts of the course that you chose to flip?
Yeah, the course was, I tried to make step by step. I didn't want to start with, a completely new course, and so just to do some piloting of these activities. And so the course was a regular course, and you said that you see that the description is very simple. Each week there was many a theme and grammar points, skills to be developed. But I try to connect online activity when it was possible. For instance, I give you a very simple example. When we talk about home, house, etc., I created some tables they'd have to fill out. I actually assigned for each one the language they were supposed to be responsible for, because maybe they know Spanish or French, or if they know 2 or 3 no Spanish, I said, okay, you are going to take care of that, you're going to take care of that. Of course, you need to organize a lot very well what you are doing. So they had to fill out these tables. I put some words, for instance, in Italian or, in French, and then they have to fill out all the rest. And then I asked them to reflect upon, similarity or differences they can find, orthographic point of view, for instance, on the roots of the words. And then I develop also the activity connecting to the roots in Latin, or, what is important for me is to show simultaneously all the languages in front of them. And I was very surprised, because at the end they said, these activities actually helped me to separate the language in my brain. And I was really surprised, because sometimes students say, I have French now, I'm so scared because I'm so confused. And this was a kind of good feedback for me. I mean, it was okay. And I could see exactly on writing that, because they were not the use of these hybrid words, you know, Spanish, Italian, kind of, and so it was a very more precise language. So I could see myself compared to a class where I didn't experiment this approach. So.
Hi,
Teresa.
Barbara.
Yes.
Teresa Fiore, Montclair State University. I'm going to go back to the fascinating initial part of your talk when you address all these issues of globalization and localization. Because I'm realizing more and more that what we're doing in the language classroom is really pushing for a paradigm shift in education on university campuses, and hopefully moving also towards the K-12 and seriously thinking about the K-16. That is to say, we're looking at the new composition of our campuses, we're looking at the new profile of learners and teachers.
Yeah.
So as we find ourselves promoting languages, it seems like we are the carriers of a new vision altogether. And so why is it that we're still in a position of defending a discipline where we are becoming the expression of what we're doing as educators at large? So my question is for you, but I guess it's a larger question for everybody here. What are the strategies that allow us to become not only interdisciplinary, but really an expression of campus life vis-a-vis the kind of diversity that you have described? What can happen with a new student seminar in terms of addressing multilingualism? What can happen when we work across not just departments but colleges? So I was wondering if you have an experience of taking all of this out of the specific Italian classroom and addressing the larger context.
No, but I work with people, you know, people from other languages, and you know, and with different experiences. I think in the larger picture, in order to have an idea, I agree with what Stefan said yesterday. I think we know better who are these human beings. You know, we need really to explore who are them, which are their backgrounds, in order then to think about, okay, we can behave and do these things, you know. We can try to, you know, design our intervention task in different way. And I think, but the starting point is there, and we don't consider that. So knowing and starting from their experience, because their experience really affect the way they learn. So you really need to explore that and starting to think from there, I think. If you want the project, I mentioned the University of Cambridge with other universities in United Kingdom has a very interdisciplinary approach, and they are trying to approach multilingualism from cognition, education, and cultural literature. So you can go in the site, and there are many of these, you know, ways they try to approach different also realities in United Kingdom. So it may be inspiring. I try to always inspiration from someone else. So
Thank you.
I don't know if I answer your question, but.
Great. I think that's. Can we give one more hand for Barbara Spinelli?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Lee Abraham. Lee Abraham is a lecturer in Spanish and serves as co-director of the Spanish language program in the Department of Latin America and Iberian Cultures at Columbia University. He has taught all levels of undergraduate Spanish courses, as well as graduate courses in Spanish language and linguistics. Lee also has served as a language program director of multiple sections and courses in different types of institutions and language departments. There, he has collaborated with faculty and students to meaningfully integrate language learning with what lies beyond the classroom in an increasingly diverse, mobile, and interconnected world. Lee's talk is entitled Culture, Memory, and Identity, Engaging the City to Transform Language Education in a Diverse, Mobile, and Interconnected World. It's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Lee Abraham.
Good morning. There is a handout that accompanies the talk that is going around, so I'll just wait a minute or two until you have that. So it is already obvious to all of us in attendance at this symposium and to my fellow presenters that there is a real urgency, not just to continue to think about the mission and role of languages, but for all of us to be at the forefront of the humanities, leading with impactful and purposeful curricular initiatives with which we adapt to transform and innovate what we and ultimately our students do, and with our curricula, language programs, majors, minors. And in so doing, we reflect the realities and lived experiences of our students and the importance of languages and cultures in the 21st century. In this new reality, and before rushing into action, we should reflect on a number of points. And in so doing, we could and perhaps should think about these questions at different levels. That is, within one, our individual courses that we teach, our lessons, our unit plans, the design of our activities, and also programmatically, that is, across a sequence of courses for a language requirement. And lastly, for a minor, a major, a certificate program in our departments and colleges. And also, and this was brought up by the question at the end of Barbara's talk, in our relationships with other departments, local communities, and institutions, including but not limited to businesses, healthcare, local and state governments, and nonprofit organizations. You will recall in my colleague Per Urlaub's keynote address yesterday at the symposium that he highlighted the importance of acting with urgency, but also with patience. Some answers to these questions that I will be providing in a moment are needed more immediately than others. We simply cannot wait or ruminate anymore. You have and will continue to be inspired by colleagues' presentations this morning and this afternoon, and in the conversations during and hopefully after this wonderful symposium. Other questions, admittedly, are aspirational. They still require more fundamental administrative changes involving collaboration across disciplines, institutions, and departments that actually empower and provide resources, financial and otherwise, to faculty at all ranks to innovate, transform, and adapt, and I would emphasize from the ground up, with each of us working together with our colleagues and in collaboration with our students, as Barbara just mentioned a few moments ago. So let me begin with the question number one. How can we demonstrate that we are indispensable, and we are, to the mission of our universities and colleges? That is, that we have something to offer beyond just seat time for a language requirement, which, as we know, is increasingly disappearing. And also in light of the increasingly shorter periods of time that students are studying abroad. Have, or should we purposefully and meaningfully redesign the language lab, the language center, the language classroom, the language curriculum, the language department to become more collaborative, innovative, creative, and dynamic spaces or hubs of curricular innovation across the disciplines for language and cultural learning through purposeful engagement with all types of communities, colleagues in other departments, on our campuses, off our campuses, and with other institutions? And perhaps more closer to home, or more closely to home, what are the limitations of the language classroom? Where does students' language learning occur? Is such learning confined to the classroom, or does, can, or should this learning occur elsewhere? How can we integrate language learning beyond the classroom meaningfully, seamlessly, purposefully with in-class learning in a mobile world where language learning potentially occurs everywhere all the time and with different modes of meaning? And I would call your attention to figure 1, page 1 of your document for just a few of those different modes of meaning. And the final question, how can language learners' interactions in and beyond the classroom empower and prepare them to deal with complexity, diversity, and change? To respond to any of these questions would require us to realize and accept that language learning has expanded to and must incorporate the lived experiences of our students in our language courses and programs. In fact, over the past several decades, we've witnessed a profound shift in emphasis in language pedagogy, away from a curriculum and almost exclusively focused on the development of linguistic competencies, towards a curriculum that increasingly responds to and seeks to incorporate the lived experiences of our students in our classrooms, who, as my colleague Barbara Spinelli just discussed in this presentation when she talked about the person in context, specifically identity, emotions, creativity, and agency. The lived experiences and identities of our students in our language courses are deeply intertwined with the notion of place. A meaningful location is defined by Cresswell. And as Cresswell points out, when we look at the world as a world of places, we see different things. We see attachments and connections between people and place. We see worlds of meaning and experience, and I quote, a gathering of things, memories, stories, and practices, end quote. So then place, our sense of place, is also socially constructed. We make and have memories, ascribe meanings to, and experience what goes on in places. Importantly, to say that place is socially constructed also suggests that we have the power to decide what physically constitutes it. The buildings, the stores, the parks, the squares, the plazas, the green spaces, community gardens, monuments, and memorials. On your document on page 6 in the appendix, there are a number of questions about your places to consider and reflect upon during and hopefully after this presentation. Any of the places that you identify and think about as you look over those questions provide opportunities for engaging place in our courses, programs, departments, and with other institutions. How so, you may be asking? Places provide pedagogical opportunities for language and cultural learning because in and through and with places and our interactions with people in these places, we build our lived experiences, and so do our students. We construct relationships and memories through our interaction with others. We make our lives through our interactions with people in the streets, the neighborhoods, the stores, the plazas, the cafes, bakeries, restaurants, shops, and in our volunteer work in social organizations. That is how we build the sense of place and of our sense and of ourselves in the world. We socially construct place. Moreover, and it's obvious to those of you in attendance, places provide the essence of so many of our literary and cultural products: travel logs, music, film, poetry, novels, architecture, and other forms of material culture. The applied linguist and language educator Leo Van Leer reminded us a decade ago that language learning must involve social engagement with the world around us. We must use our mind, our body, pardon me, and our emotions to engage the world as you do at home and in your weekend here in New York should, frankly, must be a sensory experience for you and your language learners. To do so, as Van Leer observed, requires that we see language as just one of the many meaning-making resources we should make use of as we learn and, yes, as we teach languages. We must, in the words of Van Leer, and I quote, include the body, cultural historical artifacts, the physical surroundings, in short, all the affordances that the physical, social, and symbolic worlds have to offer, end quote. Figure 1 on page 1 of your document from Kalantzis, Cope, Chan, and Dally Trim describes some of these meaning-making resources. So engaging urban and other types of places beyond the walls of the classroom, currently and historically, should, as I hope that you would take away from this presentation today, challenge and encourage us as language educators to embrace the pedagogical value of students learning with each other and with faculty in other disciplines through and with place. In so doing, we create an awareness of the humanistic issues of linguistically and culturally diverse communities in which we and our students live, work, study, and increasingly are connected to both face-to-face and online, but only if we choose to do so. When students engage with places, be these urban, suburban, borderlands, rural, they provide a lens on our humanity through which language learners see and understand and question, interrogate the past, their past, other histories, other versions of histories, contested histories in the public space. They understand themselves a little better, they understand their peers, people in their communities, and perhaps even imagine the possibilities for a just, equitable, and promising future for everyone. For many of us, place is essentially urban. Place means the city in its current manifestation. The city is alive with the cultures, histories, and voices of speakers of different languages, and also with the collective experiences and memories of cities as they are captured in literature, film, art, architecture, monuments, memorials, music, and other forms of material culture. So at this point in the presentation, you may be asking the following question: what exactly can place, more specifically cities, teach us and our students in our language courses? Why is place relevant for language education? How can place help all of us teachers adapt and transform what we do in collaboration with our students and others at our institutions and in other organizations when I'm preparing my lesson plan and activities for my next week or two? And again, I say in collaboration with our students because as my colleague Barbara Spinelli so eloquently explained about language learners in the 21st century, we can only teach and work with those students whom we actually know. Moreover, as my colleague Stefan Jaritos mentioned in his opening remarks, information about our students and their lived experiences is essential for this kind of work. That is truly learner-centered teaching. What I hope to offer today are just a few of the many ways in which place, and specifically cities, can be integrated into a curriculum. As I mentioned previously, such adaptations can be an activity in a single session or a lesson or a unit around place. For example, the historical city, or another unit could be the activist city, the literary, artistic, and cinematic city, final course projects, an entire course, a sequence of courses. There's already excellent pedagogical work with place being done by many of you here today, and those of you who are watching this video. And you already have and will learn about innovative and transformative initiatives from my fellow presenters at this symposium, whose work undoubtedly will also inspire you to think about the ways in which you can incorporate cities and other places in your language classes. However, before I share two specific examples of the potential of place in language education, and recognizing that we have so many different languages and instructional contexts present at this wonderful symposium, I would like to briefly mention the following that I think could apply to many of you here today. Number one, place provides a crucial means, an affordance or a relationship of possibility, in the words of Leo Van Leer, for language learners to critically think about places, even those urban and other spaces in which the languages we teach are no longer or not frequently found or were never spoken. Let me give you an example quickly. Students could compare and contrast notions of public space, parks, plazas, squares, community gardens, and cultural practices in the towns and cities where your universities, colleges, and schools are located with the places of the languages being studied: Hindi, German, Arabic, French, Italian, Japanese, Russian, Chinese, modern Greek, and Spanish, Catalan, to name a few. Number two, the 2017 report of the Commission on Language Learning of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, titled America's Languages, Investing in Language Education in the 21st Century, observed the following. The United States, and I quote, "The United States looked no further than its own immigrant, ethnic, and Native American communities to find the seeds of a rich and diverse linguistic future." We must begin and continue to create impactful and meaningful opportunities for our language learners to engage with heritage-speaking and Native American communities, to connect with the diasporic, migrant, and immigrant communities of these languages, to listen, to learn, to give them a voice. There's excellent work being done along these lines by many of you in attendance today and elsewhere, but we could and should do more. Students could and perhaps should work in person in their, number three, in their local communities to investigate other languages that are present, to practice seeing and observation and interviewing and describing, and other types of exercises that familiarize them with quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods of research inquiry, ethnographies, if you will, data visualization and mapping, We'll see one example of this in the next few minutes. So let me briefly turn now to discuss the landscape of language learning and teaching in the 21st century. And this is page 2 of your handout, your copy. By mentioning 2 assumptions that the Douglas Fir Group points out, which may not be readily apparent from the diagram. You will hear echoes and themes that Barbara and Per and many others today and yesterday talked about in this particular part of the presentation, so I hope it does resonate. 1, the 3 levels that you see there on page 2 are in constant interaction, influencing and shaping each other. The second important assumption, 3 levels exist in a state of continuous change. So let us recall the words of the Nobel Prize-winning biologist that my colleague Stefan Charitos mentioned in his opening remarks yesterday at this symposium. Life is change. And isn't that what makes a language educator such a wonderful profession, a calling, if you will, that we are continually reflecting and sometimes changing, transforming, and adapting our pedagogical practices to reflect these complex realities that you see on the screen and on page 2. So what are possible implications for me and for all of you of this framework as you think about your courses and your programs for the next academic year? 2 possible implications of this framework are: language learning occurs beyond the classroom. Language learning involves a repertoire of diverse semiotic resources. Language learning is embodied. It involves the whole mind-body world complex of resources and sensory experiences that could potentially and should occur when our students are learning languages wherever they are located in the world and beyond the confines of the classroom walls. Language learning is mediated by learners' social identities, a point eloquently put by my colleague Barbara Spinelli just a few short minutes ago. How could this work in the classroom? Let me provide just 2 examples of the ways in which we sought to address this question directly or indirectly, and which also aligns with the complex and dynamic nature of language learning and teaching in the framework of the Douglas Fir Group. Admittedly, these are just 2 possibilities, and I know firsthand that there are many other examples of your inspiring work with place, students, and communities, some of which you will be learning more about this morning and later today. And so the first question would be, what can students learn from the cultures, histories, and voices of speakers of different languages and cities? And so on your handout, that would refer to pages 2 and 3, the bottom of page 2 and also page 3. One more point before I get started there. There are 2 implications of this framework. Maybe go back for a moment here. I think I hopefully a number of the takeaways that I hope you have from this presentation. If we consider the realities that the Douglas Fir Group and also those that Barbara mentioned just a while ago, what does this say about what we're doing in the classroom? Or maybe what we're not doing in the classroom or what we should be doing in the classroom? And then the second the last point that I would make there is our teaching doesn't occur in a vacuum or shouldn't occur in a vacuum. Our students are engaged in these kinds of activities in English and other languages throughout their time at university and in K-12 settings. So I think that's the other thing I would like us to be mindful of. So I'm going to take you through some very quick examples. Pages, the bottom of page 3 and bottom of page 2 and the page 3 kind of provide you the nuts and bolts details, which I won't bore you with this morning. But at the heart of this, and especially at the bottom of page 2, is a diagram that I hope will resonate with many of you here today, and that is we talk about active learning. Our classes are spaces for active learning. And in that particular diagram at the bottom of page 2 there, Lee fleshes out a little bit more exactly what that can look at diagrammatically. And so what you're seeing here and described on page 3 is an example of inquiry-guided learning. And so in this process for this project, which again is described in detail on page 3, so I won't get into the details of the project. But essentially, if we talk about active learning, that means that our students are active in what they're doing in the classroom. And so in this particular project, as you see in the cycle here, they engage in a series of questions. And that is the basis, if you think about what your friends, colleagues, your partners do of any profession. Lawyers engage in questioning, doctors, scientists. So I think it's an approach to language education that is incredibly important. And if you're already doing this in your classroom with them, I applaud you. But if you're not, I would seriously take a look at some of the work of maybe letting go a little bit of what we're doing in the classroom and giving students and empowering students to take control over questions that are meaningful to them. They may or may not be meaningful to us standing in front of them every day or walking around the classroom, but they may be very well meaningful for them. And this kind of active inquiry-guided learning approach, among many others that you see there in the diagram at the bottom of page 2, could certainly help in that regard. And so essentially in the project, when we think about where we're located, see if I can get this to work here, we're essentially right about here. And so the students conducted this particular project in East Harlem. So in this particular example, and this is true of many cities, if you're from Chicago in the audience, and I believe there are, if you're from Philadelphia, if you're from Los Angeles, there are mural arts projects throughout these large metropolitan areas, and even in some smaller cities. And so this particular project is designed to get them to think about the city or a neighborhood as a site of collective memory. In this particular case, East Harlem is also a site of collective memory precisely because those communities depicted on those murals, and I'll show you an example in a moment, are no longer residing in those communities. So then the question becomes, or the question the students had, why is that the case? So this is one of those murals for the project. And so you see, and actually, it's right around, it's not that far from here if you have time on a Sunday, Mother's Day, of course, and you want to take a walk, that's about 15, 20 minutes away from here, roughly. So this is the community mural. And what you see in this particular mural are a number of figures in the community, many of whom are no longer there. And so let me give you an example of a student research question. I know I'm going quickly here because it is detailed quite on page 3. But this was done in Spanish, but I've given you the translation. This was a student's research question about the particular neighborhood because we had talked about notions of displacement, migration. And so this isn't, I didn't say to this particular student, hey, you need to talk about this particular issue. These are issues that to me as a language educator are fundamentally important for a number of reasons. I've talked about history, I've talked about memory, and I've talked about the future. And language education must, to my mind, engage that kind of critical thinking and thought. And you can only do that if you go beyond the walls of the classroom and embrace other professions, other disciplines, other colleagues, and that is what you see as the end result of that. And that's not something I had aspired to, not something I had created, but when you let students explore topics, themes, neighborhoods, streets that of interest to them, this is what you find as the end result. I'm going to turn to the second example, and that is described on page 4. And this is a course taught in English that Stefan Jaritos and I taught. And the details of the course are provided on page 4. So again, I will not go into the details. And even though this particular quote by Ida Louise Huxtable is talking about New York City, and I recognize that many of you are not from big cities, I would argue that the side streets of any town, municipality, or the streets of any town are its soul. And so if you don't have side streets that demonstrate this, the streets in your town are certainly the soul of its city. So I would encourage you to begin to think about that. So again, these are some streetscapes. And when you're looking at these images, if you care to do so, I would encourage you to look back at page 6, because really what I'm trying to do through this presentation is not talk about my examples, which may or may not be applicable to your particular instructional context, the particular student bodies. What I hope that you take away from this presentation is that the questions on page 6 and thinking about your colleagues in other disciplines and in other departments on campus are fundamentally part and parcel of what we could and should be doing to address the crisis that we've talked about in the last day or so. Yesterday, Dean Sarah Cole, the Dean of Humanities here at Columbia University, talked about how language is embedded or intimately or inextricably tied to histories, and that is absolutely the case. So one of the things that Stefan and I are trying to do, not only in the course but in general here, is begin to look at neighborhoods in a particular layered fashion. And so many of you know that we've looked quite a bit at this particular element, that is linguistic landscapes. But that is just one of the many complex layers that constitute a street or a neighborhood. And so for language learners, all of these particular features are those that you see on pages 1 and 2 of your handout. That is, it's not enough to focus on the visual and written word in our language classes. If we're concerned about heritage and Native American communities, they have a voice. And to the extent that they want to be heard, which I think is an important part, we should be capturing their histories in these neighborhoods. What are the sounds of the neighborhoods? What are the boundaries? How have these changed? This is disciplinary thinking that should be done in language courses, I believe. And this is what we're trying to accomplish with this particular course. We're also getting them to try to think critically about data, analytical reasoning, understand the limitations of the data about language learning in the American census that we have out there. This is part of our mission, I firmly believe, as language educators. We must move beyond just focusing on grammar and vocabulary. I'm not saying that those aren't important. Those are absolutely fundamental and important for our students to get jobs. But I would also argue that part of having a humanistic education through language learning involves all of the layers that you see here. And so these are the particular course objectives. Again, the course was taught in English, but I think at any level they can be working with data in Spanish. There are data sets or whatever language you're teaching. And literacies, we talk about digital literacies quite a bit, and I know yesterday we talked about the use of Google Translate and artificial intelligence. Part of what we also need to be teaching, in addition to the limitations of artificial intelligence and Google Translate, are visual literacy skills. That is, when you pick up the Washington Post, the New York Times, the newspaper of the countries that your students are studying, how is data represented visually? What are the limitations? Is it accurate? What are some of the questions they should be asking when they're seeing this kind of data presented in an increasingly multimodal world, which is also what page one by Cope and Kalantzis are talking about. And then the other piece that I think is important that I mentioned before in the talk is that we wanted students to do a kind of inquiry-based learning that gets them doing data collection, interpretation, and visualization. They're doing this in these other classes. So for the colleague in the audience who had asked, what are the ways in which we can connect with other colleagues in other departments and disciplines? I am not saying that we should design an entire course around our colleagues in geography or those who work in data science or in sociology, but they should be part of what we're doing in the classroom. We should, and if you're not doing this, I would encourage you, reach out to the sociologist, the anthropologist, the social scientists writ large, and get them engaged with your students, because our students are doing this anyway in other courses, and we as language educators must, if you're not doing it, be part of the conversation. I think we've ceded and yielded too much, and I think we need to take some of that back, and we can do that when we look at place. And that's what Stefan and I are hoping to do in this course and in future work together, is kind of take back what is ours as a humanistic endeavor. If you think about the questions in your images and you look at the questions on page 6, language is everywhere. But where are we as a profession in terms of engaging places in the communities, the heritage-speaking communities? Those are the questions I think we need to answer and respond to urgently. And some, as Per mentioned, with a little more patience, of course. And so part of what we're doing in the course, through a series of workshops in English, is to deal with data collection, data processing, visual exploration, and visualization in the course. So a series of workshops. And if you think about that, and we talk about visualization, this is what Barbara mentioned in a sense. Our lived experiences are narratives. How do you represent that? Is technology a good way to do that? Maybe it isn't. So one of the things that we have to do through this course, and I'm working with our students, as they go out into the streets and they go out into the neighborhoods, is begin to think, how am I going to tell a story about those communities? And if you back up for a moment, we should be asking those communities how they want and if they want their story told. And so those are the kinds of things that we hope to do in our work as you look at language learning as layered in terms of visualizations. So I'm going to give you one example from a student who participated in the course, and this is, again, these were student-driven questions. They had happened to do, I've done a study abroad experience prior for the particular course in Rio de Janeiro. And so part of what occurs when you allow students to have agency, and Barbara talked about this, and begin to think about their identities, in this case as a study abroad language, these are the kind of questions that can emerge. We didn't prescribe the nature of the scope of the project, but we did provide scaffolding and guidance for that. And so I'm not going to show you the example, but she essentially decided to go back and map by neighborhood issues. This is not linguistic landscape, I caution, to map the signage and some of the locations of graffitis and look at issues of census data and socioeconomic status to begin to understand if there are patterns involved in the displays of some of the signage, the emplacement of the graffiti, and whatnot throughout the nature of the course. So I have to admit at this point, I'm going to conclude, and let me just have a few short words here as I conclude my remarks today. So I hope that this presentation has demonstrated the pedagogical potential of place in language learning and teaching, whether they be urban, suburban, borderlands, rural, peripheral. And when we collaborate to adapt and transform undergraduate language curricula for purposeful and meaningful learning beyond the classroom, language learners and language educators can make important and enduring connections. They can have an impact on each other, their communities, and yes, even us as language educators. Thank you.
I'd like to open the floor for questions. We have 2 mics. You can raise your hand.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. So you talked about the importance of place. You touched a little bit on history too, and linguistic identity. How does the approach change when the place in question is a place where there is a hostile relation to a particular language, whether it be ethnic conflict or in a place of colonization or even full-blown war?
So I would address that one. I don't know that it changes. I think the first step, are you teaching a language in that particular? The first step would be to embrace it and embrace the complexity and diversity. And when you do that and bring that into the classroom and be that by having speakers of that particular language, and we have that right here, of course, in the United States currently in terms of our southern border. This is something that is very here, that is something that resonates not just at the southern border, but those communities reside throughout the United States. So this is something very human and very tangential. I say bring it into the classroom. That's part of what we try to do in that particular course, and even in the elementary Spanish course. They must think critically about these issues. They cannot accept the one narrative. That's our job as language educators. I say embrace it, bring it on, be prepared to be challenged, as I was, because our students are multilingual and multicultural. They come from different experiences in different places. They move around, they're mobile. Some of them have even lived in those conflict areas, but we can only know that if we talk about it. So I say embrace it, but be prepared that these aren't easy conversations, but I think they're fundamental conversations that language educators should be having in the classroom. And there are marvelous ways to talk about that. You have readily access to authentic materials, news clips, videos, protest as a music form, literary works. And what better way to connect current events to historical events so that they see those issues. And I was trained as a historian, I must admit, as you can probably tell. That's fundamental, because that lens will help the future. And if we ignore that lens in the language classroom, I think that's unfortunate. I don't know if I answered that question. You're welcome.
Another question for Lee?
I have a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Thank you very much for your talk, and I was wondering about your experiences with the class that you taught and sort of the applied version of what you were just discussing. And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe some of what your students had done, how they engaged with these ideas in a very specific way.
Sure. So I would say when you talk about this particular, put the student's research question back here, I'm sorry. If you know where your students are from and where they're starting from and the courses that they're taking, you will know that they often talk about issues of representation, marginalization, colonization, and decolonization. And so in this particular case, this was a student who was a sociology major who happened to be issues of, who'll be taking a course on immigration at this particular time. That's why I'm saying it's incredibly important to let our students be able to use the language and the grammar that they're learning on topics that are of interest to them. And so in this particular, this is just one particular example. We had other students that were focused more on the economics of it, because we do have, we do have students who study economics, marketing, and business. And so in that particular case, what became interesting is that the sociology student or major in the class would be challenging the economics major to say, yes, I understand the economic realities of life in the big city, but is that the kind of, and I remember this honestly, she said to him, is that the kind of future you want for the world? That's not something I can come up with. That is something that when you engage in place and you engage in contested areas, our students want to talk about these issues. And even in elementary Spanish too, with the minimal grammar and vocabulary that they have, they can get their point across. I think oftentimes when you have students talking from their disciplinary perspectives around place, and if that's the takeaway from the language requirement, I'm fine with that. That we have challenged them to say, what kind of world do I want to live in? And how do my experiences in these language classes, in talking about space, place, communities, the communities in which I reside and the communities that I want other people to have when I graduate. That, to me, is one of the most important legacies we can have as language educators. But those kinds of legacies, which Per also mentioned yesterday, can only come if you get them talking about issues that are relevant to them through inquiry-guided learning and letting loose a little bit about the classroom. And those can be done in Spanish, Catalan, Greek, modern Greek, the languages that you're teaching. You have access to those materials. You have access to communities of heritage language speakers, Native American languages, that if they're willing to do so are an incredible resource. And I know I have colleagues here who teach heritage languages that do fine jobs of incorporating and bringing them and giving voice to the classroom. And so that would just be one particular example of a disciplinary conversation. And the last point I would make on that, and I've been thinking about this a lot in preparation for this symposium, but over the last, I kid you not, 5 or 10 years, we talk about learner-centered teaching. Maybe we should be asking them what they want to learn about. I don't have an answer, but I often wonder, where is their voice? And I mentioned that earlier when I talked about learner-centered teaching, and Stefan has mentioned that, as you know, when he asked about information. I think the challenge for us seated here is we're afraid to ask the question because we may not like the answer. But I don't know if that's our job. I think that if language educators are to prepare students for the future, and I know I mentioned this repeatedly throughout the talk today, we should be doing that. I think if for the colleagues that yesterday said, what am I supposed to do when my languages are in danger, or the colleague from Southern Oregon University, and the colleague just a little while ago that said, how are we going to reach across the board? We should be asking these questions. I don't have answers yet. I have ideas. But I think that if this concerns you and what you're seeing and the student work that you're seeing and the kinds of work that Stefan and I and others are doing here in the room and that you'll hear about in a few minutes, you should be asking your students and be challenged. And of course, you can't give them everything they want. But if we're going to talk about identity and agency and emotion and investment and the multilingual students that we have, as Barbara talked about, how are you going to know that unless you ask? And I hope that answers the question or makes a point.
I don't really have a question. I have a quick comment.
Sure.
And I'm very, very happy to see that both presentations this morning have been converging and agreeing upon the fact that we're at the moment where we should think beyond the confines of the Common European Framework or the ACTFL, because we know that competencies develop differently, and that's a long talk, and I'm not going into details. Also, Lee's presentation and the question, the previous question, have made me reflect upon the fact, and I guess we should tackle that very openly, that certain languages are interesting. Let me put it this way: for universities program, and this is a cruel enough approach, as long as there are languages that are spoken in areas of conflict, where the United States have an interest to send specialists either in human rights or in other areas, and they quickly fall out of interest once that conflict is resolved. So I think that your approach, which I've been following since you presented at the 1st of May Symposium in 2015, the engagement with a place and with place and identity.
And I would also add people, which I think if that didn't resonate, that we talk about it as kind of a
yes,
walking along or bike riding along a place, but
no,
people are there. Right.
Yes, I agree. And the fact that both you and Barbara this morning opened this idea of using multiple resources and looking at the core of, putting language learning or reconsidering language learning at the core of humanities, where it belongs,
correct.
but
Correct.
in a 21st century approach, obviously, not in a modern nationalities, 19th century.
One nation, one language approach, correct.
Yes, one nation, one language approach, and museum approach, collection approach, right? Or ethnographies or comparatism of Romance languages, for example, in the late 20th century, 19th century. So it's, thank you both. And I guess we should also look at how languages are interesting if they are languages of conflict, and what we can take from there for languages that we teach that are not spoken in hot areas, politically hot areas, because there can be internal identity conflicts in heritage speakers, and I have more about this as I have a project in development, and my students have really done some interviews themselves. But I'm not going to take the time of the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So one more round of applause for both of our speakers this morning. Thank you. Yes, thank you both.